Hi there, and welcome back to the Fuse Show. Today we have Anne. Anne is the COO of privacy-focused Oasis Labs, where she's focused on growing the usage and adoption of the network's tokenization and data privacy APIs. Prior to joining Oasis Labs, she's worked on worldwide product marketing for the Apple iPhone. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Yeah, really happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So I think the domain that Oasis Labs is trying to tackle is a relatively new one. How,
Mhm.
how did that? What's the origin story behind that concept?
Yeah, so I'll say, unlike many of your hosts, I'm not a founder, but was an early
Hmm.
employee, and so I can speak a little bit to how I think the founders thought about it, and then also what it's become. Oasis Labs was actually founded really out of and born out of a lot of research done in a lab run by our CEO Don Song at UC Berkeley, and I'd say what she found and a couple of the other founders found is that they were doing a fair amount of research that both combined a couple different technology areas. So, combining privacy technology, um, distributed network technology or blockchain technology, and found that when combining a couple of these together, there was something really powerful that really couldn't be offered in any other way. And so, really, what myself and many of the, I would say, early team members were charged to do was really to think about how we take these, in some ways, kind of nascent technologies and turn that into a product and something that really could be that could address and identify and um, really really solve problems for customers. And so that's been a fun journey along the way. It's certainly an
Hmm.
emergent space, and so it's iterative as we've gone as well.
Who would you say your target customer is, and what's the use case these customers would use with these tech APIs and technologies?
Yeah, so I'd say at the highest level, the Oasis network, really Oasis Labs has built this blockchain network. It's a decentralized blockchain network.
Hmm.
And I'd say, as is true for any network, we're one team of many that's involved, and so uh, you can think about other developers adding and building on it. But at the highest level, it's a network designed really for any developer who wants to store and run compute on data but retain ownership of it. So that's sort of the highest level of what we've seen. What that means in practicality is we've seen really two developers that have come and been most interested. So one is an enterprise developer. So we've worked with a number of large companies who have really challenges around the data that they use and making sure they can both run compute, analyze data in a straightforward way without having any of the risk of that data leaking, of having
Hmm.
breaches on that data, or in many instances, accidentally looking at their own user data in a way that they shouldn't. And so that's been one area where we've seen a lot of interest. And so, like one simple example in theory of how this could work, right, is there are hospital systems that are collecting a significant amount of data around COVID patients.
Hmm.
And one big challenge that a lot of these hospitals found is due to regulatory HIPAA issues, due to just the nature of holding patient data, there were a number of issues around how you could actually share that and distribute it with other entities, whether it's
Hmm.
a county, Department of Public Health, whether it's a pharmaceutical company. There's all these inefficiencies with data that just exist right now. And so, really, the nice thing about a blockchain is it allows that entity to uh, both store the data in a way where they retain ownership and to set permissions of who can access it without giving them custody of that data, ownership of that data.
Hmm.
So that's been one major thing that we've seen really pop up. The other, which is kind of interesting, and I would say even newer, is we're seeing a number of instances where companies really want to take that one step further, which is to say, one, I want to upload this data, but two, I'm really interested in tokenizing it. And so that
Hmm.
might sound a little weird, but basically what that means is um, one, you can think of tokens in two ways. So one is I want to upload this data and I want to make sure I always have ownership of it. So I need some like ticket or way to basically say that as that data gets used on different channels or by different parties, I have this thing, this verification that says it's always mine and I can
I
use
see.
that at any time. The other is, what we've often found in the world is people basically the value system of the internet is set up in a way that's skewed. right? So right now, if you upload your data, Facebook has it. They're the ones
Hmm.
making money off of it. They're the ones capturing all the value. The same is that's just the way the internet is set up today.
Right.
And so what we're seeing more and more is this idea of how do companies actually give their users back the value and control of the network from the start. And so what we're seeing are these companies building things like an NFT for your genome, for example, where you can upload your genome, you hold it with this token,
Hmm.
and if some company uses it, let's say you say, I'm okay with the pharmaceutical having access to it, you get paid for them using it rather than the company
Hmm.
holding and storing all that value. So that I would say is a bit of a farther out use case, but it's one that we're seeing pop up more and more from smaller teams who are a bit more blockchain native as well.
So in terms of the quantity of data, like I have no doubt that Amazon on their AWS side has like many, many, many like warehouse size buildings just full of like hard drives to store all their data just because
Yeah.
there's so much amount of it. Like what is the quantity of data that you're trying to I guess encode on this blockchain?
Yeah,
And
that's
does it scale to like global scale?
yeah, I mean, it could, right? Like, I think all the data in an ideal world, all the data in the world would be stored on the Oasis network. And what that would really mean is that the more data that's stored, the more that users themselves are really put back in control of that data. And so, yeah, I think there's a world where we see more and more of that data being stored on blockchain networks. We think ours is the best equipped to handle it. And yeah, I think as we do, we'll see it's not really a question of like, is it on Amazon or is it on us? I think it's really
Hmm.
more a question of who has custody of the data and who has control of it. And so I think we'll see more and more people pivoting and moving to more decentralized systems like ours.
So when you say decentralized, these
Mhm.
nodes that control and I guess do the storage as well as processing,
Mhm.
could anyone participate in this network?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the coolest things. And like maybe to take a step back, like one of the things that got me so excited about blockchain was really that, which is like the shift in control and power that it
Hmm.
gives to individuals. And so I think you can see that at every level, right? I've talked about that as the consumer, but you can think about it as being a part of the system as well. Like one of the things that's so exciting about these networks is you're not dependent on a single company to run the infrastructure. Really anyone can. And so at its core, what decentralization means is that anyone can add their own server to the system and participate in the network. They can participate in, certainly the technology aspect, but then also the governance of it. They can participate in how the roadmap is formed in the future. And so blockchain networks really give people a much better sense of their own destiny, really. I mean, you can establish a network and a world as you want it to, rather than depending on other companies to do it for you.
So in the early stages, when you start any new project on the blockchain, it's very like network based in the sense
Hmm.
that like you
Hmm.
have to encourage people to join your network. You have
Yeah.
to encourage them to also compute or join the compute cluster as like being a node that
Hmm.
like runs some sort of like verification algorithm to verify what is like properly on the blockchain versus like fraudulent attempts to like append to the chain. So I imagine the very beginning days, Oasis is the one that controls all the nodes, or at least a good majority of the nodes. Is that correct?
So actually, no.
Oh, huh.
Yeah. So I'll say that for us from the beginning, it was really important that we hit decentralization as quickly as possible. And so, as is true for any startup, I think blockchain is the same in that you have to start with some sort of test network or
Yes.
MVP. And so we were no different. So I'll speak a little bit to the stages and then where we are
Okay.
now. Essentially, we'll maybe even think about this further in blockchain, you're really starting at an extremely base level of technology. So instead of, and this is something I'll admit, I didn't fully appreciate when I started.
Hmm.
But when you think about these networks, there's basically nothing. Like there's no infrastructure, there's no language to write your application in. There's
Hmm.
open source tooling, but a lot of it is so new that it's changing very rapidly. And so for a network, you really have to think about not just the application layer or the network layer. You have to think about everything and start from
Hmm.
the base. And so what we did is we actually took sort of a two-pronged approach here. One was we have a team that's consistently worked on usage and really thinking about how and what kind of problems we think we can solve when we get to an end state of the network, and what sort of applications we want to see built on top of the network as community members ourselves. In addition to that, we've had a team that's really building the platform and the network from the ground up and the code.
Hmm.
And so we basically then decided really early on that the most important way to build out this network was to get community members involved as early as possible. Like, the whole point of a blockchain is it's really not about what I want, it's about what the
Yeah.
community wants. And so it's like, I think a real, like, I actually came from politics, and I think it's a very similar world where it's like your job is not to tell people what to do. It's like to make everyone feel invested enough in the project that
Hmm.
they're telling you what they want, or they're doing it, or they're, et cetera. And so really, I'd say, so about 2 years ago, we launched like the first private test net, which was essentially the Oasis team ran, I think, 2 nodes, and then we invited 10 other teams to launch a node on this test net. No token of value. Like, the documentation was like a Google Doc. Like, it was just like it was pretty low level.
Okay.
Some open source code. And then basically over time, we just ratcheted that up. So we started an online community. We have a Slack that we started using to have discussions. And we started basically just launching in real time. So we started with about
Can I
10.
pause you there for a second?
Yeah.
How'd you find these initial users?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. So I think there was kind of two ways we thought about it. One was looking at, and we were lucky here, looking at other networks and how they'd gone about it and getting
Hmm.
feedback from them. I think a really nice thing about this space is, again, because it's so new, there's no competitors. It's more about like really trying to find ways to help each other. So talking to other teams, and the other actually was Twitter. Like, I just spent
Oh,
a lot of time on Twitter drilling into like who's talking about being a validator, who understands proof of stake networks. And so going about it in those two ways, I then just spent a fair amount of time just reaching out to people, asking them if they'd talk to me, getting feedback. And it became a really, I would say, organic effort to grow. And once we got those first, I would say 20, the rest became much easier because you got the word
hmm.
of mouth of building out this network. So we did that for about a year, and then when the main net of our network launched, that's when the network goes live. It's
Hmm.
public. There's a token. Uh, the network actually launched with no nodes or servers from Oasis at all, and so it's
Oh,
completely run
okay.
by a community of validators who are just keeping this network alive and building on it and adding tooling that really matters for them as well.
So they're doing it not out of a financial incentive, but because they're driven by the passion of the mission. Is that
I think there's perhaps two reasons. I mean,
okay?
certainly, as is true for any network, there's some incentives, and
Right,
so
right.
how a lot of these work are there's staking rewards, which is
I see.
essentially you get for any transactions that are run on the network, you get some benefits for doing that. So there's some incentive there, but the other is, and I think this is where I was really pleased, is that many people were just really passionate about
Hmm.
what we were offering from a privacy perspective. It's quite novel in the space.
Hmm.
So a lot of the teams interested in this are, frankly, like me, just interested in the technology, and I think want to learn more about it. And
Hmm.
as a result, like, I would say the financial incentives help ensure that it's feasible for them to participate, but the like passion and engagement that we found in the project is really about much more than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So taking a step back to I guess the previous question I asked related to
Yeah.
like the capacity of the network.
Yeah.
What if everyone on the network, and maybe this isn't even a use case that's supported, like what if everyone wanted to support or everyone wanted to upload NFTs of like hour-long 4K family videos, filmed. Like, what if someone wanted to film their entire life, live stream it, and cut it into 1 hour segments and uploads onto the network as NFTs? Like,
The
at
worst.
some point, there's just too much data, right?
Well, so actually, that's what's kind of cool about our design. So, unlike Ethereum, where everything is really blocked by, so maybe to explain blockchain networks, the way these work is there's a consensus layer, which is basically validating every transaction. So, I think of this as very simply, we'll take something quite simple like a token transfer. I have one ETH, I want to transfer it to you.
Hmm.
Do that, I both start the action, but then when I send it, it has to actually be verified by all
Hmm.
these nodes on the network and then sent to you. So it's pretty straightforward when it's a very simple transaction like that. It's basically one point of data. It gets much more complex the more data that you add. So if you're going from that to what we are actually seeing on our network, which is very complex transactions, things like running machine learning data sets
Oh,
on
huh.
a network,
Okay.
that becomes way more complex. So on a network like Ethereum, that would actually be very blocked by the power, by just like the workflow that they have.
Hmm.
Everything has to be approved at this consensus layer and then sent out. And so you can imagine almost like a log jam where it's like the more data that's feeding in, the harder it is for the data to pass through.
Mm.
Our network's actually designed quite differently, and it makes it much more scalable. And so what we do is we've actually separated out this consensus mechanism from compute. And,
I
and so
see.
what that means is you can actually run these really complex transactions and then batch them to the consensus layer so that the compute you're running is not blocked by this verification. The
I see.
verification layer is sort of added as a last touch. And so that means that actually, yeah, you can run pretty complex transactions. On top of that, the other thing I'd say is our network is very flexible. And what that means is you can actually build your own compute layer to fit the need. So we've seen, for example, like in some instances, having a pretty centralized compute layer and then a decentralized consensus layer is most valuable. Like
Hmm.
for private companies, this is a great way to have some hybrid where you're getting sort of the benefits of a public blockchain while still having the low latency of a private network.
Hmm.
But in some instances, like with NFTs, you want the whole thing to be public. You want
Right.
the whole transaction to be public, and so in those instances, using a network that's decentralized at every layer may make more sense. But what's
Mm.
nice about ours is we're not stuck to one model like Ethereum would be, or many other networks. It's really very adaptable to the needs of the developer, which is cool.
So, what's the model for Oasis to sustain its development and expansion and business development?
Yeah.
If is there like a financial model where you take some sort of like cut?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I mean, I think blockchain and crypto projects are so different than how I think we think about traditional economics for markets.
Hmm.
And I'll admit, it took me a little while to wrap my head around it. I came from, as you mentioned earlier, from Apple, where in many ways the economics are much more straightforward. Like you have a phone, you're selling that phone, like
Right.
it's very clear where the money is coming from. In this instance, the economics are interesting because it's really about in some ways, it's almost a network effect where there's some funding that, so when the network launches, there are some tokens put aside for the long term sustainability of the network. And
Hmm.
there's a foundation that's separate from where I work that is, in many ways, the custodian of that fund.
Hmm.
There's some funds that are used for operating expense, but almost all of the tokens actually are distributed to the community through grants, through paying for transactions on the network, through being able to help early backers for and supporters for the work and the funds they bring in the beginning. And so what that means is the incentives are a bit different. You don't necessarily need to think about sort of like SaaS revenue in the same way. Like
Hmm.
our goal is not to have like huge like ARR like numbers as a metric,
Right.
for
Right.
example. The goal is like how do I bring as many people to this as possible so that the utility of the network is more and more usable and viable. And that
Mm.
in itself then becomes sort of a sustaining flywheel where the more you're finding usage of the network, the more demand there is for the thing that is driving the network, and as a result, like the more you can sustain the work that you're doing. The other thing I'd say here is like, unlike a traditional company where like you would almost measure success by how much you grow, like how big is your team, how much can you fund, all of those sort of like
Hmm.
standard metrics, which I was very used to. The disorientation here is actually the opposite. It's like you almost want to say like how distributed is the team, how many
Mm.
different people are involved in it. And so, we have like almost like 6 or 7 core teams that are just involved in building the core basis of this network. And so instead of thinking about like scaling, I'm actually thinking a lot more about like communication or like
Mm.
how to coordinate without blocking people from doing the things they think are most powerful for the network. And so it's been a really cool, I think, thinking about it from like just a leadership perspective. It's like it's a lot more about motivation than it is about like it's much more carrot than stick, I think,
I
than
see.
you find at a traditional company. Yeah.
Hmm. That is new. This is
Yeah.
definitely an eye-opening
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
And the reason I love doing this show is the fact I get to talk to so many founders and hear so many perspectives that you wouldn't normally hear.
Yeah.
I feel like people who are interested in the tech space in general are usually the cutting edge of early adoption of anything, be it blockchain, be it like new like foods, new any yeah. It's so cool to see.
Yeah, I feel like for me, it's interesting. Like what brought me to this space was really just intellectual curiosity.
Hmm.
I found that I mean, I loved my time at Apple. It was so cool. And what I found at that time is, well, first of all, I learned what perfect means. Like I've never been anywhere where you can get so close to perfection, and I don't think I ever will. It's unbelievable the type of environment and culture that they've created there to really people really understand what that means. And so that's very cool to see. What I found is the other thing that really thrilled me about being at Apple was really being able to understand technology in a really deep way and
Hmm.
explain it to people in a way that just made sense. I spent a lot of time on the camera technology of the iPhones and like really being able to explain to people why certain differences in the camera were important and what value could add was really cool and fun to do. And what I found is really what drove me to blockchain, in addition to the sort of principles of it, was the excitement of taking something as nascent as it is now and actually being able to like condense it into something that makes sense for normal people. And that challenge, I think, is something I thought would be really fun and cool. And I think it's like we're in very early days, so it continues to be an area of like real opportunity for learning and challenge because I think it's still such a early technology that it's like the context and understanding that you have to talk about it is still too high, and so I think the more and more it becomes more adopted, I think we'll see less of that. But yeah, it's fun to be a part of that early stage for sure.
How big is the current active team at
Yeah.
Oasis in
Yes.
terms of building the product?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's a couple different teams involved, but in total, it's probably about 50 core people that are
50 core people. Okay.
involved every day. And then, on top of that, this community of just like a ton of other teams. So as I mentioned, there's over 100 validator companies running on the network, and those teams can range from big companies of like 30 or 40 people to like small teams of one. And
Hmm.
so there's a huge community there. And then, of course, this community of developers building apps and tooling on top of it as well. So, yeah, so in total, like hundreds of people, thousands of people. Yeah. So it's been cool.
Are there current applications that are actively live running on the Oasis network?
Yeah, so one of the ones that I'm most excited about is called Nebula Genomics. And I'll walk you through a little bit of what they do. So basically, they're a private version of 23andMe. They
Okay.
identified long ago that I think a lot of the problems with direct to consumer genomic tests, like people want them, but there's two issues. So one is the data that you can collect from a typical 23andMe study is actually pretty high level. Like there's not a ton of detail. And so, one, that having a test that goes into greater detail, it's called a whole genome test, will be really valuable.
Hmm.
The challenge there, though, is that it's a lot of information. And so, you really have to trust the provider capturing that information and sharing it with you, and really trust that they're not going to do something with it that you don't want them to.
I
And so
see.
that in itself becomes an issue. We've obviously seen that issue pop up with Ancestry and 23andMe.
Hmm.
So Nebula really set out to build a privacy first version of this tool, and we serve as the back end for their solution. And so basically, the flow is you buy a kit, you go through the steps, you send it back to Nebula, and when they send you your genomic data, you can actually decide. I'm happy to have Nebula have this, or I want to store this on the Oasis network. And when you do, you retain ownership of that data, which means that you can take it off of the network at any time without question. You can give permission to Nebula to use it for different reasons. And in the future, you can even give permission to other entities, research labs, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, to access your information if you want. The nice thing about a blockchain is you can pull it back at any time and that information will go away because you've retained sort of ownership of it. You, in some ways, have lent it out rather than
Mm.
given it to someone. So that's been a really cool example of what we've seen. And I think the next steps for them there are they're really thinking through how do we take that next step, which is are there ways to like incentive, like to give people incentives if they do upload their data, like is there a token that one can earn back, for example? Is there a way to like create an, as I mentioned earlier, like an NFT of your genome? So I think some cool things going on that front. That type of thing is something we've seen quite a bit on the network. The other app I would just mention, which I think has been really cool, is from an enterprise perspective, we're seeing the network really used for what I'd call trustless data sharing. So imagine you have two companies that are competing,
Hmm.
but there's some reason that they need to share some data. So we've been working with a number of crypto exchanges. Binance is the biggest, and they
Hmm.
have this issue where like basically for big trades, like they run into this issue where someone's running a fraudulent trade or they've been flagged by a government is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, and so they need to be able to share that information in real time with other exchanges so that that information can be that wallet address can essentially be blocked across all of them. But they want to be able to do that in a way that they, at the same time, won't be sharing all of their private or competitive information with another team. And so, using our network, they can basically store and share, feed information in, and use our network almost as a black box where we run compute on it, or the network does, and it basically will only raise a flag if two exchanges come up with the same fraudulent issue, and so then they
I
both
see.
be warned about that. So that kind of data sharing thing is what we're also seeing as well, which is pretty cool.
So at the actual layer of the, like, I guess the technical details below the API, like how is all this taking place?
Yeah, so there's a couple different technologies that are used. So one is a consensus layer of a blockchain network, which essentially means that anytime you send data to the network, you're validating that that transaction is real. And so a number of nodes are doing that. On top of that, we're using a number of confidential compute technologies. And basically what that means is, so if you think about it, all these things are run on like a chip that sit inside a server. And so normally on a normal chip, like all the information is public. What we use is something called a secure enclave that sits on that chip as well. And
Hmm.
you might be familiar, like there's a secure enclave in your iPhone. It's, for example, used to store Face ID data. It's the most protected data, and everything that's on that part of the chip in the secure enclave is encrypted. It's protected. It can't be accessed when it's in there. It
I
has to
see.
be like encrypted and decrypted to get out. So when it's in there, you can run confidential compute on it without anyone being able to see it. Now think about that sort of at scale. We're basically doing that with this data, which is you're taking raw data, you're encrypting it onto this chip, and then running analysis on it. You're running
Hmm.
computation, and then only the output is being shared beyond that like actual piece of hardware. And so and it's kind of cool. I mean, like it really means that the best visual I can think of is it's like a black box. Things go in, you don't have to look at it. No one can see it. No one has permission to see it. They can only access the computation on the other side.
So let's say I'm a business and I want to do computation. Am I the one that needs to provide the node, or do I pay someone else to use their node? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so it totally depends on the type of setup that you have. What we do is we built a number of APIs that sit on top of the blockchain. And so if you're a business, you would just come to oasislabs.com and use the APIs that you'll find in our documentation. Um,
Hmm.
we charge right now it's in beta, so it's actually free, which is a
Okay.
nice thing. But essentially what we're doing is then in the background paying the fees of those transactions to the blockchain network
I
using
see.
the Rose token. Now, over time, businesses will be able to pay for it themselves with the Rose token, which is the network for the token for our network, or in other currencies as well. So yeah, so it's pretty simple. I think for a enterprise developer, it would feel very similar to like using Stripe and thinking about how
Hmm.
you pay for something like Stripe.
So in its current iteration, is it kind of like AWS in the sense that I execute commands and there's some node somewhere in the world that runs these commands like in a secure manner?
Yeah, I'd say, hopefully it's actually even easier to use than that. I mean, I think there,
Okay,
in many ways, like I think of AWS as that infrastructure layer, and we've really tried to build up to the application layer to
I see.
provide even more support for app developers as well.
Okay. So since you're the COO, can you walk us through like what a typical day looks like if there
Yeah.
is such a thing?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about, again, being the COO of a company involved in a decentralized network is there's sort of the things we deal with every day that any COO would deal with, which is just internal company stuff. It's
Mhm.
I personally spend a lot of time on the product side, and really spending a lot of time trying to um, find bridges and connectors between product and our BD teams. I find that it's important that it's sort of just a function of where you sit. Like there's an ability to see sort of above all of it and identify
Mhm.
when there's points of inefficiency or when there's times where teams really need to talk together more. So I find I spend a lot of my day in meetings really just trying to help expedite or create more efficient interactions and more efficient decision making. So we as a team can move as quickly as possible. But the other sort of added element here is, again, we're one of many teams. And so I spend a lot of time also in in public forums for the network, doing town halls, doing events, really to share, not to tell people what's going on, but to share information about how I'm thinking about it, and really to get feedback on that. And so I found things like Twitter and Telegram are really great ways to do that. And I'll admit, like it takes a little bit of time to like shift your tone, which is like it would be faster to just be like, this is what we're doing and I'm doing it. But that's not how you build a community. And so
Right.
the real important thing is to say, this is how, like, this is one way to think about it. Are there other ways to think about it? What are we missing? Like, what other teams want to be involved in building this thing and making this decision? And so I think the role of a COO in that way is how do you create a cohesion across a whole community, and in many ways like identify again like connections to be made not only on your own team but in this community as well. This developer is working on this, you should talk to them. So I spend a lot of time doing those kinds of things. The last
Are
thing,
there
oh yeah, no, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I was gonna ask, are there specific forums that you spend more time in versus others?
Yeah, I spend a lot of times. We have a community Slack channel. I spend a lot of time there.
Hmm.
It's where more of our technical audiences stand. So I tend to spend time there looking for feedback and trying to understand whether there's issues that have popped up. I spend a lot of time in Telegram, and I also spend a lot of time on Twitter, which I is more new to me. I had sort of been a Twitter lurker, and I'm trying to be more public, but I've also found it's like a great way, particularly in the crypto space, to talk to people. I think people are very active both in
Hmm.
the way that they communicate via DMs as well as just in public. I mean, it fits with the community as well. And so I've spent a lot more time there just trying to understand what's going on, to track like quick movements. It's often where I get my latest crypto news too. So
Are you personally invested in other cryptocurrencies?
yeah, I mean, no, obviously I'll say like no investment advice or
For
anything
sure.
like that. But yeah, I found for me, I'm actually like a pretty conservative person. So ironically, being in this space, like I think maybe I feel I know enough to know that like day trading tokens is not for me. I can handle the like anxiety of it, nor like I mean I feel like I'm like 100% committed to working on my projects, so I like don't have the mental capacity. But what I will say is I think I am incredibly long on blockchain. And so
Hmm.
what I've done is basically say to myself, what are the bets that I think, what are the teams that I think will be here in 10 years? And
Hmm.
that's where I've decided to make my own personal choices in terms of how I've thought about these projects. So
Hmm.
I'm really like, obviously, in addition to the work that Oasis Network is doing, I'm always long Oasis in every way. There's some other projects that I've been really excited to be like involved in or follow, and that's Cosmos is a big one. I really see them as a role model for many in the space. They really were at the forefront of this, and it's been really cool to see what they've built. I obviously am a big supporter of Ethereum as well. I think it's, I mean, no doubt the impact they've made in this community is incredible. And there's a couple other projects as well that I think I'm eager to see. Uniswap, that I think is a great example of the app layer that, it's really just the beginning for so many of those. So I sort of like, I would say set it and forget it in some ways, or like wait, again, no investment advice, but looking for opportunities where it might be undervalued is always helpful. So now is a good time for that.
What is it about I have not, I've not looked up Cosmos in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
past, but I have heard of their name. What is it about their team that you feel makes them stand head and shoulders above others?
Yeah, I think what's so cool about them is, well, so first of all, they were just one of the first networks to launch. And so
Hmm.
I think they really set the bar in terms of how to do this. They've been big advisors to us in that way. And it's been cool
Hmm.
to see their work. The other, though, is that even from the beginning, they really set an ethos of community development and decentralization that I think has set a really like very genuine standard for how this should be done. And that I think funnels through both in how they operate. Like they have huge town halls where they discuss and agree on strategy for the network.
Hmm.
They have a ton of teams involved and are coordinating across many of them. But it also stretches out in the way they think about community. Like as I've mentioned, they've been huge supporters and advisors to us, both on a personal level and also just as a team. And that kind of thing, like, I don't know, that would never happen in normal
Rare.
time. Like,
Right. 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 Right.
Facebook and Google aren't like sharing notes, but in this space, like, that's what happens all the time. And so I think they could have chosen to be very different than that and just said, you're either with us or like, we're never talking to you. And instead, they've done quite the opposite. They're the biggest cheerleaders of projects, they're
Hmm.
the biggest supporters. And so it's something I really admire. And I think something many of us should aspire to continue to be like. Yeah, I mean, it's very early days in this industry. So it's also like there's only benefit from working together at this point.
Do you remember when you first heard of crypto and what your first impression of crypto was?
Yeah. So my brother, I have a older brother, and he started following. He I think bought Bitcoin in like 2014, and
Oh shoot.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I know. I like have never really asked him how much he, but I think more than he'd admit.
Okay.
But yeah, so like he bought pretty early and was like pretty obsessed with it. And I'll be honest in saying that like the friction, it's not that I was skeptical of it, but I was lazy. Like the friction of
Hmm.
buying or figuring out how to buy really was too much for me at the time. And I was like, okay, whatever. And then when Ethereum came along, it was kind of the same thing. It was like this is so cool. This is a game changer. And I was like, I don't know. But I think one thing that really shifted my mindset on this was working at Apple. And so, what I'd say is, when I was there, I spent a lot of time with the teams working on data protection and really thinking about how I would say what the rules around user data should be. I won't report that I made any of those decisions, but was in the room. And one thing that I'll say is I really trust Apple. Like I think what they're
Hmm.
doing is right, and I think they have a very genuine view of um, how to treat user data. They I think genuinely believe in data privacy, but I don't know if I think like we shouldn't have to trust companies. And so that for me became sort of a line in the sand, which is like what if you're not as good as Apple? Like what if you can't be trusted in that way? Or what if something changes? And so I think thinking more and more about this trust that we as individuals were putting in these large companies and frankly like didn't really have the choice to do, right? Like you're choosing between one of many entities. It just felt like sort of a false choice. Like
Hmm.
I'm going to buy a premium product and know my stuff is trusted, and I really believe it is, or I'm going to give all my data away for free to Facebook, and I don't know what they're doing. And so
Hmm.
I'll say like I think all these companies are doing a lot. I think they all genuinely mean well, and I think they're trying to do the right things for their users. So I don't really question that on like a principled level, but I think at a broader point, it's just like, is there something better for the internet? Like there's something has to give here, and I do think we're seeing just a shift in value creation from these large companies to individuals. Think about the creator economy; that's such a big piece of it,
Hmm.
and so it only makes sense to me that data should follow as well. And so that's, I think, thinking about that and realizing that, I think, is what brought me in a more fervent way to the space.
We talked previously about the high level details of how if someone owns something on your network, they at some level do deserve
Yeah.
compensation or they can define that structure. Is that something they themselves determine, or is there like agreed upon collective where like, oh, 80% of revenue goes to this person and 80% or 20% goes to this person and so
Yeah,
on?
so right now it's really set by the application developer, so they can
Okay.
decide, and you as a user can, choose to go by that or not. But
Yeah, yeah.
from us as like a network level provider, really it's about setting up the parameters so that people can set up what they want. What I will say is like there's always this struggle between like decentralization and centralization in this way, which is like on one hand you could offer people a million tools and they could decide everything. On the other, you could just provide a few and it's a better user experience, but it's more constrained. And I
Right,
think
right.
what blockchain is doing is really testing the bounds of that now. And so I think in reality, like there's some middle ground here where you're creating templates for people where they
Mm.
have the ability and you're educating them enough that they know what their choices are. But it will take some time, I think, to get to a point of like complete and utter like control going to users. Just because what does that even mean, right? Like
Right, right.
some like
It's so foreign.
help explain. Yeah, exactly.
Is there like you mentioned a template? Is there recommendations on what like certain boundaries, like good recommendations for developers would be?
Yeah, it's I think it's tough. I'll say like no, not yet. Like I think
Okay,
that's something that will need to be worked on, and it really depends on like the type of app that you're building. Like if you're simply trying to give a reward token or like a loyalty token, think about like flying on an airline, you get like rewards. Then like that's a very different like set of standards. It's kind of all upside versus like for something like a data token, like it really depends on how valuable that data is too. Like a genome can be incredibly useful for a pharmaceutical company, or
hmm,
and so there you might want to actually distribute much more of that value to
I see.
a user. Whereas if it's just like my normal like web traffic from a day, like it's actually not that valuable. Like as an individual, it's at
Right, right, right.
scale, right? But like no one really cares that I'm going on I don't know whatever site every day, right? So yeah,
So let's say in a theoretical like a theoretical future, someone wants to develop a version of Instagram and Facebook
yeah,
where it's a decentralized social network. Assume all the same features are there, except instead of the money going to Facebook, the money could be split between advertisers and could
yeah,
be split between users.
yeah.
Would it be up to the users to determine who good fit advertisers would be, or would it like how would that
Yeah,
governance
I think
take place?
so that's kind of exactly what I envision, right? Is a world
Okay,
where you're saying, okay, I'm a user of this, I'm going to go in, but I'm only interested in like serving my data to these types of advertisers. I'm
I see.
only interested in giving it to nonprofits. And I think what, control would be fair to provide in that instance is maybe there's a different level of service that you're getting. Like if you're only willing to expose your data to 1% of people that are funding the network, like are funding the application, like maybe you have a different experience. But
I see.
ultimately, I think it's more about, yeah, it is about giving users control of that and making sure that they're in a powerful position. I think we're seeing this for things like, again, creators as well, where you think about, I don't know, like take YouTube, for example, they do a revenue share with
Hmm.
creators, but in a better world, what you'd see is actually like all of that money, like by default, going to the creator, and then they then getting to decide how they distribute that out. So I, as a follower, could actually choose to like invest in the future of the creator, for example. Like so, it's a much longer term horizon in that way too.
I love the concept of supporting creators. I spend so much of my time consuming
Sure.
content by like very professional creators.
Yeah.
And one of the things that always bugged me about all the existing platforms, including Patreon, I think Patreon's probably amongst the best,
Yeah.
but even for them, you're still to deal with there's like that 3 to 5% like credit card transaction. I think it's 3% transaction fee just simply using a Visa or Mastercard.
Hmm.
I think Patreon charges an extra like 2% on top of that,
Yeah,
and then that's like the best case scenario. And
yeah,
I feel like even then, like, oh, like 95% is as good as it really gets in the industry. Like, I don't see why we can't push that boundary for like 99, 99.9.
yeah,
Maybe 100% is too idealistic because you obviously have to pay for the distribution and the
yeah,
people putting in their time and effort, and as well as for the compute and data storage.
yeah.
But like it is feel strange to me that a lot of platforms like YouTube
Hmm.
are 70. I think it's a 55-45 split, and then there's certain platforms like Facebook and Instagram where it's like straight up is 100-0
Yeah,
split.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it feels like the power dynamics really will shift. And I think
right.
I think so we actually work with this company called Music Fund, and they're actually almost investing in like the futures of musicians. And so like this model to me is so cool. So the idea is basically that like I'm a musician now, but I need cash. Like I'm a working
Hmm.
musician. What Music Fund will do is they'll actually invest in the future of the value of my royalties. So they'll say like, okay, like right now we can see via Spotify that you're making like, you know, $40,000 a year in your royalties, but we think based on like the growth you've had, that that's just going to go up. And so
Hmm.
we're going to give you the upfront cash now, and in the future we'll own 1%, 2% of your royalties for the next 5 years. And so there's something like very cool about that kind of model where it's not just like a one-off transaction. Like you're not just buying something, you're actually investing in the things that you believe
Yeah,
in
yeah.
and the creators you believe in. And so that kind of world, sure, it can happen offline. It doesn't have to happen on blockchain, but it's much more efficient if it does
Hmm.
because you can set up smart contracts, you can set up provisions and systems where that type of pay mechanism is just like built into the model from day one, rather than requiring again this trust between two parties to continue. So it makes it much
One of the
more
cool.
scalable.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh no, I was just gonna say it makes it much more scalable.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think one of the coolest things in the world is when you see like a compound effect where
yeah,
you have this like first order consequence you're trying to achieve, but that first order consequence has a second order consequence, and that second order consequence has a third order consequence, and so on.
yeah,
And
exactly.
like I think every individual has the capacity to choose, like, or at some level choose within a limited set of options the path for themselves that maximizes like I guess all the degrees of their choice. And I think it's cool
Yeah,
to see, especially in the crypto world, how there's like a lot of optimism. Like every crypto company, it increases the demand for crypto. Even maybe not necessarily like their specific coin, but like the demand for the industry as a whole is growing. There's a increasing demand for privacy and increasing demand for
yeah,
ownership back at the level of the individual versus the corporate. And it's kind of interesting to see how human history cycles between times of where it's like power is held by few versus power is held by many, and like it just kind of cycles between the two.
yeah. I totally agree, and I think it's all reinforcing as well. A lot of these,
Yeah.
I think it goes back to this idea of like all these teams are working really to build something together rather than against each other. And so, yeah, those compounding effects only add to that as well.
So we're running up on time, so I just want to ask one last question. What's the best way for our viewers to get in touch with you if that's something they want to do?
Yeah, please. So follow me on Twitter. My handle is Annie Fauve, ANNIEFAUV. My DMs are open, so happy to chat. Also, you can find our company at www.oasislabs.com. Or you can, and actually, I'll say there, all of the social channels to follow Oasis Labs are there as well. So those are the best ways to get in touch. And yeah, would love to chat more with folks about any of the things we talked about today.